Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Peter D. Jacobson, who's appearing for a second time on this program, now to discuss his latest book, Strangers in the Night, Law and Medicine in the Managed Care Era. Welcome to Rip Rap again, Peter.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jim. Thanks for inviting me.
This book kind of went off an entirely different way compared to the other one, which was on smoking.
Right.
But it did catch my attention right away because, first of all, I like the title of Strangers in the Night.
Good.
And then the sub part of it, which was Law and Medicine in the Managed Care Era. And boy, I've been talking to different people. I like to bounce that off. And I've been getting a lot of feedback from people as everybody seems to be worried about what is managed care, what's law, and how are the people in the medical profession going to coexist with this new phenomenon?
What I'm trying to do in this book is tell two stories. The first is, how does the legal system interact with medical care? Why is it important? Why do we care? Why does it matter? And secondly is to tell a story about the relationship between physicians and attorneys. Why is there so much antagonism between the two of them? In the end, I try to bring these two stories together around a new way of looking at the relationship that might help alleviate some of the tensions between patients and managed care organizations, and the tensions between physicians and attorneys. The title sort of came to me out of nowhere, as I suspect is not uncommon. I've been trying to think of how to capture what was going on. And I was just thinking about ships passing in the night as a metaphor for the interaction between attorneys and physicians. And then I hit on Strangers in the Night, Law and Medicine in the Managed Care Era.
Well, I think there's actually a third dynamic here, and that was even more impressive, which is the attempt to deal with increasing costs of medical care, now called managed care or whatever. But there's been a series of evolutions of different organizational paradigms in trying to deal with this. And underneath it all, there was this tension reflected in both sides about how do you respond to that.
You're an astute reader. I'm impressed. What's happening is, I think, very interesting. In the past, the legal system was accused of upholding physician dominance over the old fee-for-service system. When managed care came in, no one really knew how the courts would respond. Would they undermine managed care cost containment programs by ruling in favor of patient challenges to them, or would they sort of take a hands-off approach? What happened, or what has happened during the early part of managed care, is that the courts have deferred to managed care. Courts have basically said, if managed care's cost containment programs aren't working or they're going too far, it's up to the legislative branch to fix it, not the courts. We're going to let the market work. If the market wants managed care, then that's fine with us. What's interesting is one might think that there's an inconsistency in how the courts have responded. In the earlier era, they upheld physicians. As soon as managed care came along, courts abandoned the physician-patient relationship and rule in favor of managed care. In fact, I argue that the courts are being very consistent. Whoever wins in the marketplace is then the winner in the courts. Now, I've been accused of being a Marxist on that, and I think that's wrong. That's really not what this is about. It's really about the courts allowing room for innovation. When there's a new, and let's call it radical innovation, courts step back at the beginning for a lot of reasons. One is they don't understand the innovation. Initially, courts didn't understand managed care, and you see all kinds of interesting decisions that don't have a clue on what managed care is. A second point that's very interesting about this is the patient gets lost. One of the things I talk about at length here is what happened to the patient in all of these cases. I mean, how does a case get to court? A patient is denied care or his or her care is delayed because of some cost containment innovation developed by a managed care organization. Naturally, the patient is upset and may sue. When you read the cases, though, the courts talk in the abstract about cost containment. They'll talk about physicians. They'll talk about the relationship between physicians and managed care organizations, but they rarely talk about the patient. I think that's one of the criticisms I have of legal doctrine in this area. The patient gets lost.
Well, one of the things that was at the back of my mind as I was reading the book is I kept thinking this is kind of like, the whole issue of increasing costs for
Right.
medicine, for
Right.
technology, for time. I mean, for just the labor it takes in order to provide the medical care has risen rather dramatically. And so everyone's wondering, what are we going to do?
Right.
And so, there's this sorting out process that seems to be going on.
But there's another interesting phenomenon about that deals directly with that question in the cases. Managed care organizations talk a lot about cost containment programs. That's in part how they justify denying, let's say, a mammogram to a woman who's under 40 years old by saying that, given the scientific evidence, there's no reason to believe that a mammogram for a woman of that age would be beneficial. Therefore, we won't provide it. So suppose your wife is 45, the mammogram is denied, you sue. If cancer is then detected, you sue, arguing that had they provided the mammogram, the cancer would have been detected. What the managed care organizations haven't done is develop explicit cost-effective analyses or explicit cost-benefit analyses. So when it comes up to court, the court isn't faced with a direct cost-benefit analysis. Instead, the court is faced with a much more difficult challenge, which is how do you analyze the managed care organization's argument that we're saving money for the whole patient population, even though we denied care to the individual. In the old order, in the fee-for-service system, that conflict didn't arise because you paid for your insurance as an individual. One of the innovations in managed care is this bringing together of large patient populations, each person paying a monthly premium, expecting a certain level of benefits. But the managed care organization has to balance how much they're going to pay for your care and how much will be available for the entire patient population. Courts have not really done well in trying to tease out that relationship. It's not an easy question to answer.
Well, and the point that you were making earlier is really telling, which is it's one thing to talk in the abstract about cost containment
Right.
or the need to do this or to set priorities until it's Aunt Millie involved, and Aunt Millie is
Right.
outside the
Right.
parameters
Right.
of what's acceptable for providing that care, whether it's a type of operation or a certain type of cancer treatment or something. There's where the rub happens.
Right.
Or it's when yourself and you either want to or don't want to have a certain treatment prescribed and done, and under the rules, it won't be done.
Exactly. And you need to remember that courts traditionally have favored individuals. After all, most cases are about an individual versus, let's say, a corporation, a physician, but it's an individual case. Courts have always had difficulty dealing with large populations of people, class actions, for example, on let's say asbestos exposure, have not really been handled well by the courts. And I would argue that they haven't particularly done a good job on this case either. And you're exactly right in saying when my care is denied, I'm not entirely concerned about how much money is available to the patient population over time. I want to know why my care wasn't delivered. Why was it denied? What's the rationale? And how can I get that decision overturned so I may go to court? One goes back to the point I was making earlier about the space courts will give a new innovation. If you look back to when railroads were first emerging and then the development of mass-produced goods, courts stayed back. They just didn't know how to rule in the cases. The doctrine, legal doctrine that had been developed didn't apply very well. So courts give a lot of room until they became more comfortable with these cases. Another reason for that, I think, is that the way the cases are presented has confronted, has been in the context of federal legislation, the so-called ERISA law, the
Right.
Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which it's a very complex act, and I don't think we need to go into great detail, but the short gist of ERISA is that it preempts or blocks patients from suing in state courts or states from regulating managed care firms. As a result, patients, even with legitimate claims, were unable to bring them in state courts. That provided just very broad immunity to managed care organizations, and frankly, they hid behind it in ways that I think helped undermine the concept. They've won in the courts, but over time, I think they've lost in public support because they weren't forthcoming about the trade-offs that had to be made. They weren't forthcoming that some patients would be denied care as we have to deal with costs and cost containment. What they failed to do, in my view, is bring the public into that debate to tell us why we couldn't have everything now. We made this radical shift from really having virtually no limits on the health care that we got through private insurance to really very stringent at times, what we call utilization controls. That is, controls on how much health care would be provided. By not bringing in the public, what it did was encourage the so-called managed care backlash, where the public really reacted negatively, even to what I would consider legitimate cost containment programs that are needed, that were needed corrective to the excesses of the fee-for-service environment.
Well, this country's got an aging population, and we've got a huge baby boomer group that's headed toward retirement.
Well, yeah, that's true, but we also have a sense of entitlement. We don't, as a society, function very well on limits. And there are lots of examples of that. It's a society that's pushing, that wants more, either through government largesse or provided by our healthcare system. And we're not necessarily willing to pay for it, as the anti-tax revolt suggests. Still, we demand. And what's happened is you've got this sense of physicians caught between two forces. Patients who demand more care, managed care organizations demanding less care. So the physician is caught in the middle, creating all sorts of problems for the patient. And that's where that second story comes in, of the relationship between attorneys and physicians.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because there's a more varied and diverse relationship that the medical profession and the legal profession has had over the years, and you talk about some historical perspective on that.
what I find interesting is that neither side fully comprehends how intertwined they are and have become, both in terms of their day-to-day interactions and in their overall need for one another around providing quality health care to patients. If you look back, what I think has happened is that attorneys and physicians have really had a lot of strife, and the antagonism has developed over malpractice litigation.
Right.
That's the source of this searing antipathy, animosity between the two professions, almost vitriolic at times. But over the last 20 to 30 years, particularly with the advent of managed care, what's happened is attorneys have gone from sort of being peripheral to medical care, involved only in the malpractice litigation, to being a fundamental part, an integral part of the healthcare business. In, let's say, the 1960s and 1970s, healthcare was really a cottage industry. Now it's a national powerhouse. It's what, 15% of the gross domestic product? It's a huge industry. That industry cannot run efficiently and effectively without a lot of involvement from the legal system. For one thing, as it's grown, so has the regulatory mechanism. So you have that interaction. But more importantly, how has it grown? It's grown through larger systems. It's grown through acquisitions and mergers. It's grown through joint ventures. How do you develop these mechanisms? With the help of lawyers. So lawyers have been now not just antagonists over here with the doctors, but fundamental to this expansion of the industry as a business. What I think has been lost in that shift is that the two professions have a lot more in common in terms of shared values than the past antagonism would suggest. So what I try to do is lay out a rationale for why they have more shared values, why the antagonism is less important in the managed care era, and why the shared values are more important as a means, as a point of departure for developing a more cooperative relationship. As a result, the last chapter talks about reconciliation.
Well, there's something I thought I noticed too, where the actual practitioners on both sides are in different roles than where they started out from. You have doctors under the fee-based system that were able to make all the decisions about what would happen in their practice. Now they're like employees of some other corporation.
Right.
The attorneys had a similar process. They started out, they could run their own office.
Right.
Now they're part of some larger corporate entity and being assigned these rather large administrative roles, actually, at making things run. And so they're put into positions that they may not feel comfortable with, but have to do, based on their assignment.
No, exactly right. And I think that's one reason why they should start thinking about what they have in common, because they face the same pressures. They both face, in addition, a decline in public esteem over time, even though I think they're still, by and large, well respected. They don't maintain the high levels of status that they once did. And that's another part of the problem. They are fighting for status in the country. But again, if you look at the changes you just talked about in terms of how both professions have developed, what's the common denominator in that? And it seems to me the common denominator is around the health and well-being of the patient. The lawyer wants the patient to get care. The physician wants the patient to get care. To some extent, there's now a common enemy, and that's the rigid bureaucratic institution of managed care.
There was just that scandal where the healthcare provider, what was it, the South?
Health South.
Health South.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they run rehabilitation centers.
Yeah, was found to be, to
Right.
put it politely, out of compliance with basic accounting principles.
Yeah, shall we say that there will be, at a minimum, civil penalties to be paid, and there's still potential criminal liability under some of these laws, depending on how systematic and how extensive. But I think that does make the point that in one era, the physician was against the attorney in many ways. That's not the case any longer. And there's got to be a mechanism for using that shared value to change the culture.
Well, you talk in your book about how the vast majority of practicing physicians appear to accept the validity of these economic incentives. But on the other hand, there's also the question, and you point that out, of the fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
And that's just
Right.
a huge
Yeah. It's
concept.
It's a huge concept, and let me try to explain it in brief and what I'm trying to do with it. Fiduciary duty on one level is a very simple concept. If I'm your fiduciary, let's say you've entrusted your money to me, my duty is to invest your assets to your best interests. If I'm your attorney, my fiduciary duty to you, my duty of loyalty, my duty of obedience to you is to advocate on your behalf. It's not to say, oh yeah, Mr. Opposing Counsel, that's a great argument. My client should be hung for that. I agree with you. Take him away. Excuse me. So I do have a duty of loyalty. A physician has a basic fiduciary duty to his or her patient, to act in the patient's best interests. But we now have a very different system where the fiduciary wears more than one hat. So that managed care, remember I talked about that managed care fiduciary. Remember I talked earlier about the problem, the conundrum between protecting the assets for the patient population and still providing care for the individual. That's what the managed care organization has to balance. What I'm arguing here is that the managed care organization has a fiduciary duty. And I'm willing to accept that it has to balance between these two sometimes conflicting roles. How do we develop rules so that the patient, the individual patient, still is protected, still is able to challenge a delay or denial in care? So what I'm doing with this fiduciary duty concept is saying, first, everyone understands it, everyone in the system. Lawyers have an obligation, physicians have an obligation, fiduciary obligation, and managed care organizations have fiduciary obligations. We may define them very differently, but they all understand the concept. Secondly, given this, how can we use that to improve healthcare and minimize the tension between attorneys and physicians? So what I want to set up, in brief, is a system where instead of fighting these cases in court, instead of attorneys and physicians going at it and throwing in managed care organizations, I want to take it one or two steps back. I want to set up a system where the burden is on the managed care fiduciary to say why your care was denied. The fiduciary has to show a valid medical reason and a valid administrative reason why he or she is favoring the patient population over the individual. Then if the fiduciary meets that burden, you can deny the care. What this does, or would do, is primarily increase communication. It forces the attorney to talk to the physician. It forces the managed care organization to talk to the physician. It compels the managed care organization to communicate with the patient's attorney. So take an example that you'll find fairly typically in these cases. I'm in and out of the hospital for, let's say, respiratory problems. And I've used up a certain number of days. Haven't used them all up of what I'm entitled to. But the managed care organization is delaying deciding whether I can be transferred or sent to a specialist or kept in the hospital, whatever. In the meantime, I'm getting sicker. So eventually, I'm going to have an adverse reaction. Then we litigate. That's pointless to me. Why are we spending all of those resources on the litigation? Why isn't there communication up front? So in my process, in my fiduciary duty framework, if you will, if the parties would have to sit down and communicate right away as soon as this issue comes up. So you wouldn't have this endless delay. You could resolve it. In the cases, what you find is managed care organizations approving the care 2 weeks later after it's too late. Why the delay? And I think out of this, attorneys and physicians would start to cooperate more and start to see that they have more in common than they recognize.
Listen, this is a brilliant book, I thought, and it addresses a really important issue that's of concern not just to the medical profession, nor the legal profession, but to people in their everyday lives. When they get those chest pains and turn up in the emergency ward and start filling out the papers, they're triggering this whole system.
Yeah.
And somehow we need to live with it.
Yeah, and we need to figure out a way to organize it more for the patient and less for the healthcare providers themselves.
Well, thank you for appearing on Rip Rap again.
My pleasure. Thank you.